Well, I like to think of the EU as a political system because it's by calling it a political system, it's saying that it's more than just an intergovernmental body, but it's less than a United States, a sort of federal state. And as a political system, it's been set up to govern the single market on a continental scale. So we've set up some executive institutions like the Commission and some legislative institutions, the European Parliament and the EU Council, and together those institutions govern the single market. Well, I think the UK has historically had a very big influence in Brussels. I mean, two of the major policy objectives of the EU over the last 30 years, the single market, creating the single market, so removing barriers to the free movement of goods, services, capital and labour, and enlargement of the EU to the member states from Central and Eastern Europe, they were British agendas. So these two major areas were a British agenda. But over the last decade, there's largely been a perception in Brussels and in some of the other capitals in Europe that the British government has taken more of a sideline, has been outvoted more in the council, has not taken such a leadership role. And I think that's partly why we now have the referendum. If it's just a narrow majority in favour of remaining in the EU, there's still going to be a question mark about how committed really are the British people and the British government to the project. Is this question really resolved? Is it off the table, or is it going to come back on the table? So if there is a big majority in favour of remaining in the EU, say 10, 12, 15 point majority, then the question is the British government going to retake a leadership role in the EU as it did, in the 80s and in the 90s? After a perception that over the last decade, the British government has largely sat on the sidelines and let Germany and France and the other member states run the EU. Most voting age people haven't had a chance in their lifetime to exercise their preference on whether Britain should be a member of the EU. And I like to think of this as a major constitutional choice. So as a political scientist, I like to think that referendums are a good idea if it's a major constitutional issue, if it cuts across party lines, and if it has multi-generational consequences. So, certainly our membership of the EU fits those criteria. So it's something that is beyond just the type of thing that you discuss or parties would decide in elections. So I think it's important we have a referendum on this, and it's important then I think people realise that this is a major constitutional question, because there's big issues here. This is not just about, are we a member of an international organisation? Are we a member of this continental political system in which we live? I think it's more than for generations we've had political leaders pretending that the EU isn't really important, the EU doesn't really matter. And I think a lot of the Leave campaigners have a legitimate argument to say, no, the EU is really important. The EU does exercise sovereignty in a certain sense over us in certain policy areas. And that's why I think it's justified we have a referendum.